By 10 in the morning, Russell Mercer had signed his name 7 times in blue ink and lied 3 times with the same 2 words. "I'm fine." He said it to the woman at the county clerk's office when she slid probate forms across the counter and gave him the soft look people saved for funerals and surgeries. "You doing all right out there alone?" she asked, tapping one line with her nail. "Initial here too." "I'm fine," he said, initialing where she pointed. He said it to Del Corman at the feed store when Del helped him load mineral blocks into the truck and asked, "You need a hand getting those yearlings to auction, Russ? Storm coming in fast from the west." "Nah, I'm fine." Then he said it to Rita at the diner when she set down his coffee and didn't write anything in her pad because she already knew his order from high school, from when he used to come in with his brother Noah, mud up to their knees and laughed too loud for a weekday morning. "Got colour in your face at least," Rita said. "That's something." "Yeah," Russell said, wrapping both hands around the mug so she wouldn't see his fingers shake. "I'm fine." Rita held his gaze a second too long, then gave him a nod that was kind enough to hurt and moved on to the next table. Outside, the sky had that pewter cast that made the Bitterroot foothills look closer than they were, flattened and waiting. The radio in his truck hissed around a weather alert he barely listened to. Winter storm warning, reduced visibility, travel not advised after noon, and he shut it off with his knuckle. The silence in the cab felt better than hearing someone else predict what his body already knew. Storms had a way of turning his blood to wire. He drove the 12 miles up to the homestead with both hands rigid on the wheel, the tires crunching through old snowpack and fresh powder. Fence posts leaned at tired angles along the county road. Cottonwoods stood bare and pale, their branches like fingers spread against the sky. By the time he turned through the open gate, fine snow had begun to stream sideways across the yard. The house sat where it always had, low and square, paint gone to grey. His father's boot scraper still leaned by the steps, rusted through in one corner. A chain hung on the barn door where his father used to loop his gloves to dry. Every object had outlived the hand that used it, and Russell moved among them like a temporary tenant. Midge met him halfway across the yard, black and white coat blown ragged by the wind, ears back, eyes bright and worried. She pressed against his leg hard enough to stagger him. "Hey, girl," he said, crouching into her fur. "I'm here." She whined in her throat and licked at his glove cuff like she was making sure he was real. She had gotten old all at once in the last year, white frosting around the muzzle, stiffness in her hind legs on cold mornings. But she still watched him the way she used to watch his father, as if people were jobs, and she had never learned to clock out. Inside the mudroom, he hung his coat, kicked snow from his boots, and stood too long looking at the row of hooks by the door. His father's old canvas jacket still hung there, shoulders sagging, one sleeve torn near the elbow and never mended. Noah's orange beanie was still shoved on the top shelf where he'd tossed it the week before that storm 3 winters ago. Russell reached up automatically, touched it with 2 fingers, then pulled his hand back like he'd brushed a hot pan. In the kitchen, he spread papers over the table and tried to work in straight lines. Assets, debts, sale dates, contact numbers. Cattle count, tractor appraisal, acreage estimate. The tasks were blunt, measurable things. He trusted blunt, measurable things. At noon, his attorney called. "Russell, it's Annette. You got my email about the deed transfer?" "I saw it." "Good, and I need confirmation on intent to liquidate livestock. Buyers are pressing for timeline before roads get worse." He looked out the window toward the south pasture where brown backs moved through drifting white like half-submerged rocks. "Working on it." A pause crackled across the line. "Working on it means yes?" "It means I'm handling it." "Okay," she said, gentle in that professional way that made him want to hang up. "Your dad's estate can't stay open forever, And I know this is difficult. He pinched the bridge of his nose and stared at the faded burn mark on the table where Noah had set down a cast-iron skillet as a joke and caught hell for it. Everybody keeps saying that, like it helps. I know. Another pause. Do you have someone with you? He almost laughed. I've got a dog. Russell. I'm fine, Annette. She let that sit between them, then said, Weather report's ugly. Don't be out late. After he ended the call, he sat without moving until Midge nosed his knee. He'd learned to outlast most feelings by waiting them out in stillness, but grief didn't leave when ignored. It only changed shape. It became bookkeeping. It became errands. It became the way his jaw ached from clenching in his sleep. That night, shaking came anyway. It had been coming for 3 winters now, always when the lights were off and the house dropped quiet enough for memory to speak in its own voice. He would be half awake and back in that white field at 29, watching Noah's red hood vanish in blowing snow 10 yards ahead, then 5, then gone. The sound of him shouting had carried weird in the wind, stretched, flattened, wrong. Russell remembered lunging forward and finding nothing but a shoulder-high drift where there should have been a person. He remembered searching until dawn with volunteers and dogs and thermal cameras and prayers from people who still thought prayer changed outcomes. He remembered the official words, exposure and presumed deceased, as if language could make a body appear. Noah had never come home. Russell had told himself a different story ever since. He failed once, and now he would fail in useful ways. Pay bills on time, fix gates, sell stock cleanly, put endings in order. Practical failures were survivable. By early afternoon, snow had thickened enough to erase the far ridge. He pulled on insulated coveralls, grabbed fence pliers and staples, and headed back out. If the north line went down, yearlings could drift through and break an ankle in the draw. Practical, measurable. A job with an answer. At the barn, old Walter Pike from the neighbouring place rolled up in his side-by-side, bundled in a Carhartt coat so stiff it looked carved. "You're still messing with fence today," Walter called over the wind. "Just checking weak spots." Walter spat into the snow and narrowed his eyes at the sky. "Storm's turning. I'd leave it." "Can't." Walter glanced at Midge circling Russell's boots. "Take the dog then. She's smarter than both of us." Russell managed half a smile. "That's not saying much." Walter's face softened under his grey beard. "Your dad used to say there's no shame waiting weather out." "My dad also drove tractors with no brakes." "Fair point." Walter lifted a gloved hand toward the hills. "Still, don't prove anything to nobody today." Russell nodded like he agreed. Walter lingered, maybe wanting to say something about Noah, about fathers, about town gossip, about loneliness. Instead, he only said, "If you get turned around, you aim for my place lights. I'll leave the yard lamp on." "Thanks." When Walter drove off, the little vehicle vanished in blowing white before it reached the gate. Russell felt the familiar impulse to call him back, ask him to stay, admit that some days the silence in the house felt like pressure on his chest. But the impulse passed. He loaded the truck and whistled Midge in. She jumped up beside him, tail thumping once against the bench seat. "Just the north fence," he told her as he started the engine. "Then done." She leaned her head against his arm as if she'd heard promises before. The track to the north line was rutted and half drifted over. He drove slow, wipers grinding, windshield turning opaque every few seconds before the blades clawed sight back. The world narrowed to hood, ditch, post, snow. He found 2 broken insulators near the creek cut and fixed them with hands already stiff in wet gloves. He walked another 100 yards, checking tension on the wire, boots sinking knee-deep where wind had loaded the low spots. Midge stayed close, shoulders dusted white, occasionally racing ahead, then circling back to bump his leg, keeping count. By the time he got back to the truck, daylight had gone dim and colorless, though his watch said only 3:15. He climbed in, cranked the heater, and flexed his fingers in front of the vents until pins and needles pain brightened his palms. His phone showed 1 bar, then none. He held it up near the windshield like that might persuade a tower to appear. Nothing. He keyed the engine and turned toward home, but after 50 yards the track disappeared under wind-blown drift. He eased forward, peering for fence posts on the left and the old cottonwood snag on the right that marked the bend. Snow moved in sheets across the headlights, then in spinning columns that swallowed depth and distance whole. He drove until the hood seemed to float in milk and stopped because forward motion had become faith, and he had run out of that. He cut the engine to save fuel. In the sudden quiet, the storm sounded bigger, not louder, an endless pressure against the truck walls. Midge stood with front paws on the dash, panting, ears pricked hard. Russell checked his phone again, then laughed once without humor. "No signal," he said aloud, as if reporting to someone. "Perfect." He waited 10 minutes, maybe 15, hoping for a break in the white. None came. The windshield frosted from the edges inward. His breath fogged the glass. He pictured the fuel gauge dropping, night falling, temperature plunging. Staying put was textbook right. It also felt like sitting inside a box while memory scratched at the lid. He opened the glove compartment, found his father's old compass, and watched the needle jitter. North meant nothing if every direction looked the same. "Okay," he whispered. "Okay." Midge whined low, not frantic, just urgent. He clipped on her lead, shrugged into his coat again, and stepped out. The cold hit like a slap. Snow drove sideways, stinging the strip of skin between hat and collar. The wind took sound and bent it. Even his own breathing seemed to come from somewhere else. He shut the truck door and lost sight of it when he turned his head. White above, white below. White where the horizon should be. "Easy," he told Midge, though she was the steadier of the two. "We stay close." She trembled at first, pressing against his knees. He felt that old dread rise sharp and metallic at the back of his tongue, the same instant recognition that conditions had crossed from hard into dangerous, that one wrong choice could become permanent. 3 winters collapsed into one moment. Noah's red hood in white wind, his own voice hoarse from shouting a name no weather returned. Russell swallowed hard and forced his thoughts to simple steps. Find cover, get out of wind, reassess. He turned in a slow circle, eyes narrowed against blowing ice, searching for any shape that wasn't storm. The terrain here sloped toward a tangle of timber and basalt outcrop. If he could reach trees, maybe there'd be less drift and a line to follow. Midge stopped shaking. It was so sudden he noticed it, like a dropped sound. She stood still, head high, nostrils flaring. Her ears tipped not toward the truck, not toward home, but toward the dark smear of timber at the edge of visibility. A soft, almost questioning whine came from her throat. "What is it?" Russell asked. She looked back at him, then toward the trees again, waiting. He took one cautious step that direction, then another. The wind seemed to shear overhead while, at ground level, there were brief pockets where it eased enough for him to hear small things. The hiss of dry snow skimming crust, Midge's tags tapping her collar ring, his own coat fabric creaking at the shoulders. He scanned for branches to break for fire, for anything dry enough to catch. His boot struck something solid beside a low rock lip. He crouched, brushed powder away with numbed fingers, and stared. A neat pile of split larch kindling sat tucked beneath the overhang in a nest of dry needles, sheltered from the snow. Fresh cut, clean edges. enough to start a fire quick if he had one match and steady hands. Russell looked up fast, heart hammering. Nothing but whirling white and dark trunks beyond. No footprints that lasted longer than a second before drifting closed. No voice, no engine, no person-shaped answer. Midge gave that same soft whine toward the timber, tail level now, not tucked. Wind roared in the treetops, but around the little rock hollow the air held strangely still, like the storm had forgotten this one pocket of ground. Russell crouched there with the kindling in his gloved hands and felt something shift inside him. Not relief exactly, not belief, but the unmistakable sensation that he was no longer entirely alone in the weather. The sensation lingered, accompanied as stubborn and improbable as heat in cold fingers. Russell stayed crouched under the rock lip, one glove on the split larch, and listened hard enough that the muscles in his jaw ached. Wind shredded itself through the crowns of the firs above him, a steady freight train rush. But down in the hollow, there was a strange dampening, as if sound had to bend to get in. "Hello," he called. The word vanished into white. No answer came back. No engine rev, no shout, no human cough. Just the storm and Midge's breathing, quick puffs turning to steam. He picked up one stick and turned it in his hand. Fresh resin smell, sharp and clean. Cut faces pale gold where the blade had bitten. Not old camp scraps gone grey, not rotten deadfall. Recently split wood protected from snow, exactly where a person looking for shelter would kneel. "Walter," he tried louder. "That you?" Midge angled her head, listening toward the timberline, not toward the open field where Walter would have come from if he'd followed the track. Her tail stayed level. No tucked panic, no hackles, no bark. Just intent. Russell straightened slowly, knees popping. He was suddenly aware of every practical thing at once. Dropping temperature, failing light, truck somewhere behind him, no signal, wet gloves, fingers already clumsy. He should have gone straight back to the cab and waited it out with the hazard lights blinking until dawn if he had to. That was the conservative choice, the adult choice, the one search and rescue flyers told you to make. Yet, the larch in his hand kept tugging his attention like a sleeve. He pulled his lighter from his coat pocket by habit, thumbed the wheel once to make sure it sparked, then tucked it back. He had 3 emergency matches in a waterproof tube, too, unless he'd used one last fall-burning baling twine and forgotten to replace it. He didn't check. He didn't want to know he'd been that careless. Midge stepped forward 2 paces toward the trees, then stopped and looked over her shoulder at him. He gave a short, disbelieving laugh. "You taking point now?" Her ears twitched. Another soft whine, higher this time, almost coaxing. Russell glanced back the way he thought the truck sat. Nothing but white motion. He could have been 20 yards from it or 200. The wind had erased edges so completely that distance lost meaning. He'd seen that before, the way weather could unmake scale, turn a pasture into open ocean and a ditch into a cliff. He crouched again and swept his glove through the snow under the overhang, making sure he hadn't imagined the rest. More kindling was tucked farther back. Thinner sticks, twigs shaved to curls, even a fist-sized knot of dry bark. Whoever placed it had done so deliberately, layered from thick to thin, like they expected numb hands and failing patience. "Okay," he said quietly, not sure whether he meant the cache or the dog or himself. "Okay, I see it." A memory punched through without warning. Noah at 14, kneeling by the old fire pit behind the barn, grinning while their father lectured them on teepee stacks and airflow like they were preparing for Arctic expedition instead of a hot dog roast. "Don't fight cold with panic," his father had said, tapping Noah's forehead with a blackened stick. "You fight it with order," The memory would usually drag Russell straight down, a drop through guilt, then anger, then the blank bottom where he spent most nights. This time it snagged on something else, on the dry wood in his hand, on the fact that order had been offered to him in the middle of chaos by someone somehow. He moved by rote, scraped a shallow depression with his boot heel where the rock would break wind, set the thicker splits first, then the shaved twigs. Hands shaking, but less than before. One match from the tube, a hiss, sulphur in his nose. He cupped the flame in both gloves until it caught and licked up through the bark. Orange bloomed, tiny but undeniable. Heat reached his face in thin waves. Not much. Enough. Midge lay down beside him, not pressed against his leg like fear, just close, chin up, eyes fixed toward the trees. Firelight pulled copper from her old brown irises. Snow gathered on her back and slid off when she shifted. Russell held his palms over the little flame and felt stinging life crawl back into fingertips. He breathed slower on purpose. In through nose, out through mouth, the way the EMT had told him after Noah disappeared, when he couldn't stop shaking long enough to answer questions. "Good girl," he murmured. "Whatever this is, you're handling it better than me." Her tail thumped once. Minutes passed in a weird, stretched quiet. The storm didn't lessen. He could hear it battering the tops of the trees, hurling itself past. But the pocket held. Snow still drifted in, yes, yet not in the violent horizontal sheets from the open slope. More like sifted flour falling at an angle. Russell kept glancing into the timber until his eyes watered from cold and strain. He saw nothing he could name. Dark trunks, snow-veiled branches, the occasional shape that looked like movement until it resolved into blowing boughs. Then, between gusts, something shifted behind a stand of fir 40 yards out. Not a full body, just a vertical interruption where there should have been nothing but storm and trees. It was there for half a second, maybe less, then gone. Russell stood too fast and almost kicked the fire apart. "Hey!" he shouted. "You out there?" Midge rose but didn't bark. She leaned forward slightly, weight in her front paws like she did at gates waiting for a cue. No answer. He waited, listening. His own pulse boomed in his ears. The little fire snapped once, a resin pop like a tiny gunshot. Somewhere deeper in the trees came a muted crack. Branch under load maybe, or footfall maybe, impossible to tell through wind. He crouched and pinched the fire down with snow until only smoke threaded up. Waste of dry wood to leave it burning if he moved, and he couldn't stay here all night. He fed the unburned splits into his coat, shoving them inside against his chest, then tightened his zipper over them. Awkward, but better than leaving them. When he stood again, he realized his breathing had changed. For the last 3 years, fear in snow had always gone one way. Straight back to Noah, to that helpless, roaring emptiness, to the fixed idea that weather took what it wanted and ignored the rest. But now, another thought kept intruding, irritatingly practical. Who stacked this? Not in a grand, cosmic way. Not miracle, not omen. Carpenter questions, ranch questions, blade angle, wood species, placement, intention. He was curious. The feeling was so unfamiliar in this context that he almost resented it. "Come on," he said to Midge. "We keep moving while we still can." He clipped the lead shorter and stepped out of the lee of the rock. Wind hit them immediately, harder than before, needling his cheeks raw. Visibility dropped to a loose tunnel of grey and white. He turned what he judged east, toward where the county road should run if his bearings hadn't drifted. Midge planted her feet. He tugged once. "Heel!" She looked up at him, then toward the timber to his left. Back to him. Left again. "No," he said automatically. "Road's this way." She didn't fight exactly. She just stood with a quiet stubbornness he recognized from herding days, when she'd refuse a bad command from an inexperienced hand and wait for the right one. Snow feathered her whiskers. Her eyes didn't leave him. Russell swore under his breath. "You're a dog." Her ears flicked as if in polite disagreement. He took 3 steps east anyway. The ground under the top crust gave a little, softer than it should. He stopped, tested with his boot toe. Hollow pocket beneath, maybe drift over brush, maybe edge of a wash. Hard to tell. Midge whined once, low and urgent. Russell backed up, pulse ticking higher. He pivoted toward the timber she'd been signaling. Fir trunks offered at least fixed reference points, and if he could find the old line fence eventually, it would lead him home, even blind. He knew that. He'd known it all along. But he'd been reaching for roads and engines and maps because those were modern and reasonable, and because old instincts carried old ghosts. "All right," he said. "Your way for now." They moved in short, deliberate pushes. 15 steps, pause, scan, listen. His world shrank to immediate tasks. Place boot where snow looked wind-scoured and denser. Avoid rounded drifts that might hide deadfall. Keep leash untangled. Keep hands working so fingers didn't freeze into useless claws. Every time he halted to reorient, Midge did the same thing. She'd glance not at him, not at the ground, but out toward the outer fringe of visibility where trunks dissolved into blowing white. She'd hold that gaze for a beat, then look back, as if checking whether he'd seen it too. At first he saw nothing. Then he caught it again, a dark movement pacing parallel to them maybe 50 yards out. Tall enough that its upper mass passed behind lower branches where a deer would move beneath. Too smooth for a man fighting drifts waist-deep in heavy boots. Too controlled for panicked wildlife. It advanced, paused, advanced, each stop occurring when he stopped. Russell blinked snow from his lashes and squinted until his temples hurt. The shape vanished. Reappeared 2 trees over. He felt the old adrenaline dump, cold and electric. Fight or flight, with nowhere to run and nothing to fight. But threaded through it now was that same stubborn curiosity, sharper than fear, for one startling second. It's staying out at the edge, not closing distance, not charging, not circling behind, keeping lateral, as if matching his line. "Okay," he said aloud to the storm, voice rough. "I see you." Midge's tail moved once, small and steady. He tried an experiment without fully admitting it to himself. At a fork between a shallow draw and a slightly higher bench, he angled right toward the draw, the route that looked shorter, but drift-loaded. Midge hesitated, looked hard left, then followed because the lead asked her to. 3 steps in, snow swallowed his boot to mid-thigh. He yanked free, cursing. The next step would be worse. From somewhere off-left came a solid, dull thump. Not gunshot, not branch snap. More like wood struck by something heavy. Russell froze. A second thump followed, same interval, same tone, hollow and resonant through the wind as if knocked on a dead trunk. Midge swung immediately toward the sound, ears high. Russell stared into the murk and caught the moving dark again, now up on the firmer bench, partly screened by trees. It had stopped, waiting. He swallowed hard. "You've got to be kidding me." He backed out of the draw and angled left to the higher ground. Snow there held better, crust breaking only to his ankle. Easier going. Not easy, nothing was easy, but survivable. They progressed that way for several minutes, maybe 10, maybe 2. Time had turned gelatinous. Russell kept stealing glances toward the parallel shadow. Sometimes he saw only a suggestion of shoulder or back, through gusts. Sometimes nothing at all for long stretches, and he'd start to think he'd invented it from exhaustion until Midge would flick her gaze outward, and he'd catch a movement again exactly where she indicated. "Whoever you are," he called once, not bothering to hide the strain in his voice. I could use less mystery and more directions. Wind answered by shoving a fist of powder into his collar. He coughed, laughed despite himself, then clamped his jaw against another surge of memory, the image of Noah's hood, the frantic shouting, the endless white. It rose, as it always did, ready to drown the present. But the present kept insisting. Boot placement, dog breathing, dark shape left of that split trunk fur. Move. Curiosity didn't heal anything. It just occupied the same mental space grief wanted to fill, and for now that was enough to keep him upright. Midge began to pull slightly ahead, no longer dragging behind his knee. Her stride had purpose to it, not frantic, working pace. She'd glance back every few yards to make sure he was still there, then look out to the tree line with an expression so eerily human it made his throat tighten. This way, keep up. They crested a low rise scoured by wind and dropped into a strip of thicker timber where visibility improved from 10 yards to maybe 30. Trunks gave him rhythm. Left, right, left between dark columns. Snow muffled everything below knee height while the canopy hissed above. At the far edge of that strip, in a brief clearing between gusts, the shadow resolved more clearly than before. High, broad-shouldered, dark against white, moving with deliberate economy through drifts that reached Russell's knees. It angled across his field of view, then stopped near a leaning spruce and turned, not fully toward him, not away either. A waiting posture, patient almost. Russell stood still with his hand clenched in Midge's lead, chest heaving, and felt that impossible sense return stronger than before. Not safe, not certain, accompanied. The shadow moved first. Not toward him, across him, left to right along the edge of the clearing, where wind had stripped the snow down to a hard, rippled crust. It went through drifts the way a boat shoulders chop, steady, economical, never splashing panic. Russell caught the line of a back, a rise of shoulder, the long swing of an arm. Too tall for any man he knew, even bundled in winter gear. Too upright and fluid for a bear in this depth of snow. He stood with his breath burning in his throat, fingers locked around Midge's lead so tight he'd have marks later, and waited for the charge that never came. The figure stopped near a split spruce, turned enough that its outline broadened, then held still. Snow streamed past both of them in parallel bands. Midge did not bark. She didn't cower either. She watched with ears forward and body balanced, the way she watched cattle she didn't entirely trust, yet didn't intend to spook. Russell heard himself say, absurdly polite, "All right then." The shape angled away again and moved on. He tested it, took 6 trudging steps forward, then halted. The figure halted too, still far out, never closing the gap. He moved, it moved, he stopped, it waited, always keeping to firmer-looking ground where wind had combed the surface into low, glazed ridges instead of deep, pillowed traps. Once, when he veered downslope on instinct toward what he thought might be the easier grade, the shadow swung wider upslope, paused, and looked back, if that slight turn of upper body counted as looking. "Russ," he muttered into his scarf, hearing how wild his own voice sounded, "you are not doing this." But he was already doing it. The storm shifted pitch around the trees, a shrill edge riding atop the deeper roar. Branches clacked overhead. Snow found every seam in his clothing and slid icy fingers down his spine. Still, the pattern held. Dark shape ahead and left. Midge pulling just enough to keep him honest, Russell planting each boot in the firmer marks where crust had been tested, first by something heavier than him. He tried to reason it down to known categories. Lone hunter, no blaze orange. Logging crew member. No machine noise, no second set of lights. No shouted curse at weather this bad. Moose, Wrong gait, wrong shoulder movement, brain under stress misreading distance and scale? Maybe. Hypothermia came with strange certainties, and he was cold enough to bargain with stupid ideas. Then the figure passed between two trunks no more than 8 feet apart and cleared the space with room to spare. Russell stopped pretending it was a trick of perspective. "Okay," he said louder, to the storm or the thing or both. "I'm staying where I can see you." A gust erased it entirely. His heart kicked once, hard, and he nearly lurched forward blind to keep contact. Then Midge leaned into his knee and gave one short woof through her nose. Not alarmed, just directional. Russell followed her gaze and found the shape again, farther along, waiting by a snag that looked like a broken spear driven into the snow. The first clean fear had gone from his system, burned off by exertion maybe, or crowded out by concentration. What remained was thinner, stranger, vigilance without panic. Like approaching a skittish horse at dusk, hands open, eyes soft, body ready. He trudged on. At the next rise, visibility fell to almost nothing. White turned luminous, depthless. Russell could barely see Midge's shoulders in front of him, only the dark blot of her head and the line of the lead disappearing into storm. He turned what he thought was east, chasing the memory of county road and truck and practical choices, and took 10 careful steps. The ground vanished under his next foot. Not a drop. Not yet. Just a sudden hollowing, crust collapsing to his shin with a hollow whoomp that echoed under snow. A buried lip, a drifted cut. He jerked back, lungs seizing. From somewhere left and upslope came a sharp, resonant knock. He froze. Another knock followed, same tone, spaced like a signal. Wood on wood. Not random breakage. Intentional. Midge swung left so fast the lead went taut. Russell stared into the white and saw, faint through blowing sheets, the shadow beside a dead standing trunk. One arm lifted, then lowered. It moved westward 3 paces and stopped. Every hair on Russell's neck rose under his collar. He backed out of the hollow pocket and angled toward the sound. Snow firmed immediately underfoot, crust cracking but holding. 10 yards on, the white thinned enough for him to make out a line running low and dark across the slope. He squinted, brushed ice from his lashes, and almost laughed from sheer shock. Barbed wire. Old 4-strand fence, top line sagging, lower 2 swallowed in drift. Cedar posts canted but unmistakable. His father's north property line, the one boundary the mountain and weather could blur but not erase. "You found it," he said, not sure whether he meant Midge or the shadow or some stubborn fragment of his father still lodged in the land. "You actually found it." Midge trotted along the fence with renewed purpose, tail level, occasionally hopping drifts where the line dipped. Russell kept one gloved hand on the top wire when he could, feeling the rough bite of frozen barb through leather like braille for home. Follow this south and west and you hit the old pump shed. Beyond that, the barn lights, if the power held. Beyond that, a door he knew how to close against wind. The figure paralleled them on the timber side of the fence, never crossing. It moved with the same unhurried cadence, as if this pace suited both weather and intention. More than once Russell lost it behind trunks and thought, "That's it, gone," only to catch a fresh silhouette farther ahead where terrain tightened and choices narrowed. Disbelief had nowhere left to stand. Too many coincidences stacked too neatly. Kindling in shelter, knocks at the right moment, this line in a whiteout no-map app could rescue him from. Wonder arrived unwillingly, like thaw water finding hairline cracks in concrete. It wasn't soft, it hurt, because wonder meant admitting he wasn't the only mind making decisions out here. Because wonder meant his old story, alone always, because that's what storms do, had just taken a hit. He kept his voice low, almost conversational, as if not to scare game. "I don't know what you are. I'm not going to chase you. I just need to get us in." The shadow slowed. Ahead, where the fence kinked around a dense cluster of young fir, it stepped into a more open strip, no more than 30 yards from Russell now, close enough that he could see snow clinging in patches to its dark coat, or clothing, or hide, he still couldn't tell. Close enough to register breadth through the chest and the length of forearms hanging low and relaxed. Midge stopped, ears up, and took one cautious step forward. Russell started to call her back, then saw the figure do something that emptied the warning from his mouth. It lowered itself, slowly, onto one knee in the snow. No pounding display, no lunge, just a deliberate reduction of height, shoulders angled slightly away, hands open near its thighs. A posture he'd used himself with frightened calves, and once with a feral shepherd mix behind the feed store dumpsters. "I'm here, I won't crowd you." Midge stood very still. Snow sifted onto her back and melted in tiny, dark pinpricks. She lifted her nose, tested the air, and gave a soft huff. Then, without pulling the lead, she took 2 steps closer until Russell felt the slack line brush his glove. "Easy, girl," he whispered, though she was already easy. The figure remained kneeling. Steam or breath ghosted once in front of where its face should be, then vanished in the wind. Midge sniffed again, tail making a single measured sweep. Not greeting exactly, not fear. Recognition of intent, maybe, the way dogs read what humans miss. Russell felt something in his chest loosen by a degree so small it might have gone unnoticed on any other day. "It's all right," he said to both of them. After a moment, the figure rose in one smooth motion and resumed its place along the fence line, increasing distance again as if the brief closeness had been for the dog's benefit, not his. That, more than anything, convinced him he wasn't hallucinating. Hallucinations didn't negotiate. They followed the fence through a low saddle where wind slammed hard enough to stagger him sideways, then down toward the cottonwood draw. The trees there showed only as pale columns in the storm, their bark silver against white. Russell knew this stretch blindfolded in summer, could have driven it with a bale trailer half asleep. In winter, in this weather, it might as well have been another planet. Then, through the wind, came a sound that didn't belong to timber or weather. A thin, ragged bawl. Russell stopped so abruptly Midge bumped his leg. He listened, head cocked, heart stuttering. There, again. Higher this time, strangled by gusts but unmistakable. Clover. "No," the word tore out of him. "No, no, no!" He left the fence and plunged toward the sound, breaking trail knee-deep, stumbling, catching himself on nothing. Midge lunged ahead, barking now, sharp, urgent bursts she only used for sick calves and snakes. The ball came once more from downslope near the pump shed, where the roof had sagged 2 winters back and never been fixed. Drift trap country. Russell crested the little rise above the shed and saw her. Red flank half buried, head heaving, eyes rolled white, front legs pistoning uselessly and packed snow up to her belly. Clover, the bottle calf his father had carried in the crook of one arm during spring mud, now a full heifer, and still dumb enough to nose any open gate. "Hey, hey, girl!" Russell shouted, sliding toward her. "I got you!" His next step punched through to thigh and stuck fast. He lurched, went down to one knee, ripped free, gained 2 yards, sank again. The drift around Clover had a crusted rim and hollow center, a bowl waiting to swallow weight. She bawled and thrashed. Each kick compacted snow tighter around her. "Easy, Chloe, easy," he panted, voice breaking. "Stop fighting, baby. Stop." A dark blur passed him on the left, fast and low through blowing white. The figure reached Clover in 3 strides. Up close, its size became undeniable, head and shoulders higher than the heifer's back even half crouched, torso broad enough to block the wind in a moving wall. It planted one leg deep for balance, slid both long arms under Clover's chest and flank, not grabbing hide, not wrenching horn, but placing weight where leverage lived, and lifted, not a jerk, a steady, practiced rise. Clover's front end came free first. Snow sloughed off in heavy sheets. The figure shifted, turned its own body between her and the driving wind, and held her upright long enough for her hind legs to find purchase. She lurched once, nearly folded, then stumbled forward out of the bowl with a wet, desperate snort. Midge circled her immediately, nipping the air by her muzzle, barking in short command bursts like she was still 10 years younger and working a spring roundup. Russell stayed where he was, half kneeling, chest heaving, watching the impossible happen in plain sight. The figure kept its body angled as a windbreak until Clover had taken 3 shaky steps. Then it released, backed away one pace and lowered its arms. No threat display, no claim, just completion. Clover shook hard from nose to tail, spraying snow and ice, and turned blindly toward Russell at the sound of his voice. He reached for her halter ring with clumsy hands and caught it on the second try. "Good girl," he choked out. Good girl." When he looked up, the figure was already retreating toward the cottonwoods, broad outline thinning into white, as if kindness required no witness beyond the ones it helped. Clover's breath came in wet, panicked bursts against Russell's wrist. Her halter strap was stiff with ice where snowmelt had frozen and thawed and frozen again. He had one hand hooked through the ring, the other braced in the drift to keep from sliding, and he could still feel the shape of what he'd just seen as clearly as if it were pressed into his palms. The figure had lifted her like it had done this before, like it knew exactly where to place force and where not to. "Easy," he said to Clover, but the word broke in the middle. She jerked her head, eyes rolling, and he leaned into her neck, forehead against her coarse winter coat. Heat from her body bled through his gloves, through his sleeves, into his face. Midge circled tight around them, barking once, then twice, then dropping to a worried whine when Clover stopped thrashing. Russell tried to stand and couldn't. His knees simply folded under him into snow up to his thighs. For a second he thought he was slipping, blacking out, hypothermia finally collecting on its debt. Then his chest seized and he understood. This wasn't collapse. This was something opening. He bent over the halter ring and started to cry. Not the quiet, tight crying he'd done once in a truck cab after signing Noah's death certificate, with presumed printed above the line. Not the controlled, jaw-clenched kind that passed for composure at funerals. This came out ugly and loud, dragged from somewhere below language. His breath hitched hard enough to hurt. His shoulders shook so violently he nearly lost his grip on Clover. Snow and tears and snot ran together. He didn't care. There was nobody to perform for, no clerk, no lawyer, no men at the feed store measuring strength by what went unsaid. "I'm sorry," he heard himself say into Clover's neck. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He wasn't sure who he was saying it to at first. Clover flicked an ear back and leaned her weight into him, alive and warm and trembling. Midge shoved her muzzle under his elbow and licked at his chin, whining as if trying to stitch him back together. The words kept coming anyway, torn loose now that the first crack was made. "Noah, I'm sorry." He sucked in a ragged breath that turned to a sob halfway through. "I should have held on to you. I should have. Wind took part of it, shredded it through cottonwoods. He forced air into his lungs and tried again. "I left you. I left you out there." The old argument rose instantly. You searched till dawn, you called everyone, you did everything you could. The one everyone offered, the one that never touched the actual wound. Russell shook his head hard enough to fling tears from his lashes. I called it bad luck, he said, voice raw. Called it weather, called it God's will, called it anything but what it felt like. Midge pressed harder against him. Clover stamped once, testing her legs, then stood still. What it felt like, he said to the white air, was failing you. He coughed, swallowed cold, and kept going because stopping would mean stuffing it all back down again. And he suddenly knew, with the same animal certainty he used when he knew a gate chain wasn't secure, that if he did that now, it might calcify forever. And Dad? The word splintered. He squeezed his eyes shut. Dad, I'm sorry too. For turning this place into paperwork. For pretending that was easier than missing you. For coming up here to sell everything because if I sold it, I wouldn't have to feel any of it. He laughed once through tears, a wrecked sound. I kept saying I was fine, to everybody. Like that was a plan. A gust slammed sideways through the drawer and blew powder across his back. Somewhere to his left, deeper among the cottonwoods, a branch knocked against another in a hollow wooden note. Russell flinched, looked up through streaming eyes. The dark shape was farther out now. Retreating, almost gone into white. Wait! The word escaped before he could decide whether to say it. The figure paused barely, just enough that he could tell it had heard a movement from their direction. Then it stood still, broad outlines softened by snow. Russell wiped his face with the heel of his glove and stared at it through burning eyes. His throat hurt, his nose ran, his knees were numb from ice. He felt 40 years old and 9 years old, and no age at all. I don't know what you are, he called, voice breaking on every other syllable. But thank you. Wind swallowed most of it, maybe all. The figure gave no visible reaction, no wave, no chest beat, no claim laid on the moment. It simply remained where it was while he dragged breath after breath through a chest that had been locked for 3 winters. Midge's barking had stopped entirely. She stood at Russell's side, tail low but not tucked, gaze alternating between him and the fading outline in the storm, as if keeping tabs on both wounded animals. Russell stayed on his knees another long minute, crying until the force of it subsided into shudders. The storm did not pause for him. Clover did not become less heavy because he was grieving. Nothing about the physical world softened, but something in him had changed state, from frozen to moving maybe, from solid block to water, painful, messy, real. Eventually he drew one long breath that didn't hitch, then another. Okay, he whispered, more to himself than anyone. Okay, we move. He pushed up, slipped, swore, got one boot under him and stood. His legs shook. Clover leaned into the halter, eager for firmer ground, and he used her weight as a counterbalance while he found the drift's edge. Midge ranged ahead and back, checking both of them, impatient now that work had resumed. Russell looked once more toward the cottonwoods. He could still make out the figure farther back now, a dark vertical stroke among pale trunks. He nodded without thinking, the way men nod at each other across corrals when there's no time for speeches. Then he turned Clover toward home. They moved in starts and stumbles across the back of the pasture, Russell at Clover's shoulder, one hand in her halter ring, the other out for balance. Snow crust broke unpredictably, sometimes holding his weight, sometimes dropping him to the knee. Clover's flanks heaved. Each exhale burst white in the wind. Midge flanked left, then right, then left again, steering Clover away from drift pockets with quick nips at the air and sharp little barks. Russell kept searching for landmarks and found them one by one, like old friends re-emerging from surgery. The bent T-post by the wash, the dark hump of the collapsed pump shed roof, the line where pasture met the first yard fence. The house still didn't show, but he knew the shape of the ground under his boots now. That knowledge felt almost holy. The figure remained parallel at a distance, always outside easy focus, appearing where the timber thinned and vanishing where snow thickened. Not leading so much as accompanying the line of their movement, matching speed, never pressing close. At the edge of the cottonwoods nearest the yard, Russell lost it completely. He stopped and turned in a full circle, breath sawing, snow needling his cheeks. Hay. Nothing but white and trunks. He took 3 steps toward the trees, pulling Clover, and Midge immediately cut in front of him and blocked with her shoulder. Firm, corrective, the way she used to block calves from bad gaits. She looked up at him with an expression so direct it felt like language. Not that way. This way. Russell hesitated, then nodded. Right. Barn first. The barn doors were drifted halfway shut. He wrestled one open with his shoulder while Clover pushed from behind. Warmth didn't hit him. Barns in January are cold as iron. But the wind dropped, and the sound changed from roar to muffled thud on boards. It felt like stepping inside a held breath. "Come on, girl! In! In!" Clover stumbled into the center aisle, sides quivering. Russell slammed the door behind them and dropped the crossbar into place. Midge shook herself hard, spraying snow against tack hooks, then went straight to Clover and licked her muzzle in brisk strokes until Clover snorted and nudged back. Russell stood with one hand on the door, head bowed, listening to 3 sets of breathing settle. His own was still ragged, but slower now. Less like panic, more like work. He got moving on instinct, broke ice in the water trough with a maul, tossed fresh hay from the loft, ran gloved hands over Clover's legs for cuts, checked hooves, checked gums, checked eyes. She was shaken, exhausted but upright and responsive. He rubbed her briskly with old feed sacks to pull damp from her coat. "All right," he murmured into her neck. "You're all right. Dumb as a post, but all right." Midge sat 2 feet away, watching every motion like foreman and witness. When Clover finally dropped her head to hay, Russell leaned both elbows on the stall rail and let his forehead rest on his sleeve. Exhaustion crashed through him so suddenly he swayed. A sound came through the barn wall then, faint, almost lost under wind. A single soft knock. Hollow wood on wood. Russell lifted his head slowly. He waited for a second knock, louder, like earlier in the timber. None came. He walked to the big door, lifted the bar, and cracked it open against the drift. Snow blew in around his boots. Yard lights from the porch cast a weak amber cone that died 10 yards out. Beyond it, cottonwoods thrashed and bowed. No shape moved between them. No footfall, no crashing retreat, no final look over a shoulder that might have made the whole thing easier to narrate later. Just storm. He stepped out onto the packed threshold and listened until his ears hurt. He never heard it leave. "Russell!" The shout came thin through wind from somewhere near the lane. He turned. A flashlight beam jittered through white, then resolved into Walter Pike, hunched in his coat, one hand on the fence, the other waving the light. "You alive over there?" Walter shouted. "Yeah," Russell called back. His voice cracked halfway and he cleared it. "Yeah, we're in." Walter fought through drifts to the barn, boots punching deep. "Power flickered at my place. Saw your yard light and then couldn't see it again. Thought maybe—" He cut himself off, looked past Russell to Clover in the stall. "Hell, she gets stuck." "By the pump shed." Walter blew out a breath. "Bad pocket there. You get her yourself?" Russell looked at him, then past him to the cottonwoods moving in white sheets. He could still feel in his forearms the impossible steadiness of that lift. "No," he said quietly. "Not by myself." Walter followed his gaze, squinted into storm, and said nothing for a long second. Then he nodded once, as if filing the answer where older men file things they won't interrogate in bad weather. "Well," he said, rubbing snow from his beard, "you're both upright. That's what counts tonight." Russell let the barn door fall shut behind them again. Inside, with the wind muted, the world narrowed to hay smell, animal heat, the rasp of Clover chewing, Midge's tags clicking when she shifted her paws. He put one hand on the stall rail and one on Midge's back, and stood there until the shaking in his hands turned from cold to something else, and, for once, didn't scare him. By April, the snow line had crawled up the slopes and left the lower pasture in bands of wet brown and new green. Runoff filled the ditch beside the lane and made the road to town a ribbon of ruts and reflective mud. Morning sun hit the south side of the house long enough now to warm the porch boards, and Midge claimed that patch like it was wages owed. Russell stood at the north fence with a bucket of staples hooked over one arm and a coil of new wire at his boots. The old posts leaned like drunks. Frost Heave had popped two clean out. He drove one back with the post maul, each strike ringing through his shoulders. Thud, set, thud, set. Work that answered itself. A truck came up the lane and stopped by the gate. Annette climbed out in city boots, already losing the argument with mud, legal file tucked under her arm in a plastic sleeve. "You weren't kidding about rough roads," she said, picking her way over. "You made it." She looked him over in that quick attorney way that pretended not to be personal. "You look different. Sunburned?" "Present," she said, and handed him the sleeve. "I brought amended documents. Before I file anything final, I need direct confirmation. Last month you instructed liquidation of most livestock and listing the property." Russell wiped his glove on his jeans, took the papers, and flipped to the highlighted sections. Lines and boxes. Places to end things. Annette watched his face. "Do you still want to proceed?" He looked up past her shoulder at the pasture. Clover stood near the barn, thick and red and indignant as ever, shoving at a mineral tub while Midge supervised from 3 feet away like management. Beyond them, the cottonwoods were leafing out pale green, hiding their winter bones. "No," he said. Annette blinked once. "No to immediate liquidation. No to selling." He tapped the page with one finger. "I'll move some head in the fall, keep what the place can carry. But I'm not closing it. I'm keeping the homestead." Annette held his gaze another second, then nodded and pulled a pen from behind her ear. "All right, then we change intent, revise tax strategy, and you're going to have a lot more maintenance than you planned." "I know." "You sure?" He thought of whiteout and kindling under stone, of a soft knock through barn boards and a shape fading among cottonwoods without asking for belief. Of kneeling in snow and finally saying his brother's name out loud like a wound instead of a courtroom exhibit. "Yeah," he said, "I'm sure." She offered him the pen. His hand was steady when he signed. Annette capped the pen and glanced toward the barn. "Town's been taking bets on what you'd do." "Who's winning?" "Rita said you'd surprise everyone. Dell said you'd sell by June. Walter refused to bet and told everyone to mind their own business." She tucked the file back into the sleeve. "You heading in later? Clark needs one original before 5. "I can make town." "Good. And Russell?" He waited. "I'm glad you changed your mind," she said simply, then turned back toward her truck. He watched her go, then lifted the maul again and drove another staple home. By late afternoon, the diner smelled like coffee, fryer oil, and wet denim drying on chairbacks. Boots lined the mat by the door in muddy rows. Rita moved between tables with a coffee pot in one hand and practiced authority in the other. Russell came in with fence dust on his cuffs and probate papers in a manila envelope. Conversations dipped a notch when he crossed to the counter, then resumed with the deliberate casualness of small-town courtesy. He took the same stool he always had. Rita set a mug down without asking. "Colour in your face," she said. He almost smiled. "That's something." She leaned her hip against the counter, studying him. "You get the papers sorted?" Dropped at the clerk's. "And?" "I'm keeping the place." Her eyebrows lifted. "Well, I'll be damned. Dell owes me pie." At the end of the counter, Del Corman turned on his stool. "I heard that." "You were wrong," Rita said. "Wouldn't be the first time." Del looked at Russell. "Glad to hear it, Russ." Walter came in then, stamping mud from his boots, and took the stool on Russell's other side. "Rhodes soup," he announced to nobody in particular. Then to Russell, quieter. "Fence holding?" "Mostly." "Need a hand tomorrow?" "Yeah. North corner post." Walter nodded once. "I'll bring the auger." Silence settled for a minute, companionable and thin. Silverware clinked. Someone laughed from a booth. The espresso machine hissed like wind through fur, then stopped. Del cleared his throat. "So," he said, eyes on his mug, not on Russell. "Folks said you got turned around bad in that storm." Rita shot him a warning look, but Russell raised a hand slightly. "It's okay," he said. He wrapped both hands around his coffee. Heat soaked into his palms. He could feel everyone within earshot listening without appearing to. "I did get turned around," he said. "Truck got lost in the white, no signal. Midge and I headed for timber." He paused, choosing plain words. There was dry kindling waiting under a rock. Fresh split. Then something kept to the tree line and showed us firmer ground. No one interrupted. Even the booth laughter had gone quiet. Russell continued, voice level. "When I went the wrong way, it knocked on a dead trunk. Twice. Got me back to the north fence. Near home, Clover was stuck by the pump shed. It pulled her out before I could reach her." Del stared at him, mouth slightly open. Walter did not look surprised. He only watched Russell with his chin tipped down, listening. Rita asked softly, "You see who it was?" Russell shook his head once. "I saw enough to know it wasn't anyone from town. Big. Careful. Kept distance." He looked down into his coffee where his reflection bent in the dark surface. "It helped us. Then it left." "Left how?" Del asked before he could stop himself. Russell thought of the last soft knock against the barn wall, of opening the door to wind and cottonwoods and nothing else. "I never heard it go," he said. The silence that followed wasn't skeptical exactly. It was the kind people hold around graves and newborns and other things that don't improve under argument. Finally, Walter grunted. "Storm Country's older than us," he said. "That's all I know." Rita set the coffee pot down and put a slice of pie in front of Del without being asked. "Pay up," she said. A few people chuckled, tension easing. Conversation resumed in threads around the room. Nobody asked Russell to prove anything. Nobody told him he was mistaken. Nobody made a joke sharp enough to nick the edges off what he'd offered. He drank his coffee while evening light thinned against the diner windows. When he stood to leave, Rita touched his sleeve. "You doing all right out there alone?" she asked. Same words as months ago, but different now. Russell looked toward the door where mud and sunset and the long road home waited. He thought of Midge on the porch, of Clover bawling for feed, of fence posts that still needed setting, of Noah's beanie on the mudroom shelf and the fact that he could touch it now without jerking his hand away. He thought of grief not gone, just no longer the only voice in the room. He nodded. "I'm not alone," he said. Outside, the air held that damp spring chill that promised another cold night. He started the truck, turned toward the foothills, and drove home along the fence lines as dusk gathered. At the gate he sat for a moment with the engine idling, listening. No knocks, no movement in the cottonwoods, only frogs beginning in the ditch and wind easing through new leaves. He shut off the truck and stepped out anyway, boots sinking slightly in thawed earth, and looked toward the trees where winter had once closed around him. "Thank you," he said into the evening. Then he went inside, hung his coat on the hook by the door, and left a space beside it open.